You can use stencils and other non-porous objects to make some pretty outstanding prints in alcohol ink. That's right, this incredibly fluid medium works in a really unique way with stencils. This isn't how you're used to using a stencil though. There are some tricks. Let's check it out. The print of your stencil will be of the positive space, not the negative open areas. So that is the plastic area of the stencil. This is backwards of the way we typically use a stencil. Here, our medium is pulling underneath the stencil. And so the areas where it's touching the surface that we're printing on will appear darker. You're not limited to pre-cut stencils either. Here, I cut this stencil by putting a piece of Yupo through my Cameo cutter. The key here is to use a material that will not soak up ink. No paper, no cardboard. Yupo is a polypropylene plastic and perfect for cutting stencils. Let's not forget the tried and true methods of cutting a stencil by using scissors or an X-Acto blade. Anything that you can cut will work just fine as long as it is non-porous and lays flat against the surface you're working on. This effect will also work with full shapes. No open areas at all. So here I'm going to use a die cut just to pop out some simple geometric shapes. Time to make a print. This will work on any flat surface suitable for alcohol inks. So you can use glass, metal, ceramics, plastic, basically anything slick. Here I'm using Yupo. It's what I typically work with alcohol inks. If it's your first time, you may want to use a ceramic tile. These are great because you can completely clean them off and try again. After placing the stencil down, I drip a very small amount of ink right where the stencil makes contact with the surface. Alcohol inks are so incredibly fluid. The ink immediately runs under the stencil and spreads following the contact points. I suggest using a translucent stencil to start with. This way you can see how far the ink has spread underneath. It's pretty incredible how far it goes, and in this case, less is more. Too many colors and you'll get mud. Limit your color palette and use your ink sparingly here. Remember, the goal is not to fill in all of these open areas. The negative space is not our concern. The positive area is where we want the ink to be, right underneath that stencil. If your stencil seems to be floating a little bit above the surface after you've dropped the ink down, give the stencil a little push to make contact to the surface. The ink will hold everything together. As you can see, the ink doesn't immediately spread. It takes a little time to reach its destination. So give them a little bit of a pause, work in another area, and then come back to a place so you don't oversaturate, especially if you're using multiple colors. Alcohol inks dry through evaporation, and now we've given them a place to hide, away from air underneath this stencil. These are going to take at least 30 minutes or more to dry. There is a sweet spot with the dry time. With a stencil, it's not a huge deal. You can let that completely dry before peeling it off. But if you've used small cut pieces of, say, Yupo or something else, if you let that completely dry, you may effectively glue that to the surface of your work. There is a binder in alcohol ink, and in fact, you can kind of use that for some collage techniques, but that's for another video. The important part here is that the ink sets up at least a little bit, so timers definitely help in this situation. If you pull the stencil up before the ink has had a chance to set, it will simply pool into an area and you'll lose all indication that you had a print to start with. Once you've waited about 30 minutes, a good way to check and see if it's ready or not is to peel a little corner up. If the ink stays in its place and doesn't pool, then you're good to go. Once you peel the stencil up, these will likely be wet, both the stencil and your work. Set those off to dry before you do your next layer of work. Stencils loaded with dried ink from this process can be reprinted. Remember, alcohol ink always re-wets with more alcohol. Here, I'm using 91% isopropyl alcohol in a spray bottle to wet the surface and to reactivate the dry ink on my stencil. Even used scraps with color on them can work for this. The use of alcohol to activate this second print will lighten the colors on here. These second prints have a different look altogether. There's more of a halo effect around the edges of where the stencil would be. The darkest values are no longer concentrated directly under the stencil, but now have formed more of an outline around its edges. For this demonstration, I'm going to be working in layers. I'll put the shapes down first, let those dry, and then do the cut stencil after that. I'll also be using gold, which acts a little different. Here, I'll start with a wash of color. This will unify the work and eliminate any unwanted white areas. For more tricks and tips on alcohol ink basics like this wash, check out my video, Alcohol Ink, How It Works, and Ways to Use It. Now that we have the wash down, a quick spritz of alcohol will add an interesting texture to this background and give my cut shapes a good surface contact before adding more color. Adding alcohol before adding the shapes to the surface is not 100% necessary. It just helps keep them in place because these like to scoot around a little bit as you work on them. Once they're down, you can add color. I like to also have a little stick that helps push things down and draw the color along. Once this layer has been given time to dry, I lay down my Cameo cut stencil. This one has red ink already on it, so I'll expect a transfer of that color, plus the gold I'm going to put down. Gold and the other metallic alcohol inks need to be shaken well before use. Those tiny little metallic pigments need to be suspended in their binder before applying. Pro tip: after you've used alcohol inks a couple times, the ink will glue itself to the lid. Have a pair of pliers handy to get those colors open and ready for when you want to use them. The gold ink behaves a little differently than the colors do. It doesn't flow quite as much, and it holds to the line of a stencil really well. So in this case, I'm going to have a very crisp outline of this bird. The fact that it does not flow as much does mean that I will add more of it than I would if I were just adding colors. Time for the reveal. And now as I pull this stencil up, you can see the gold has reactivated the red, and now what's left is this metallic red print of my stencil. I hope you learned some new techniques that you can add to your alcohol ink works. If you did, hit that like button for me so we can share this information and all become better artists for it. Till next time, stay creative.